Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to author Alexandra Hudson about how cultivating the misunderstood virtue of civility can help us overcome our individual anxieties and social pathologies. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, reformers, social entrepreneurs, nonprofit executives, religious leaders, scholars, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. My name is Jeremy Beer. Thank you for joining us. Well, all right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on October 30th, 2023. And I am, per usual, in our Phoenix, Arizona studio, enjoying the beautiful fall weather finally, and also enjoying, quite unexpectedly, a Diamondbacks World Series run. Game 3 is tonight. I'm glad I'm doing this podcast today before I go to the game tonight, because I may not have much of a voice after tonight. Last month, I had the opportunity to enjoy the beautiful fall weather in my home state of Indiana. And while I was there, I had the opportunity, quite by chance, to attend a talk by our guest, Alexandra Hudson. The topic was civility. But rather than the usual fuzzy and fluffy, can't we all just get along and just be tolerant and accepting way in which this topic is usually discussed, I was pleasantly surprised to hear something much more substantive. So I'm really excited to have Alexandra, or Lexi, as I've been told I may call her, with us today. Lexi lives in Indianapolis, where she is an adjunct professor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. She is the founder of Civic Renaissance. We'll hear more about what that is in our discussion. She was a Novak Journalism Fellow. She is the creator and developer of a TV series called Storytelling and the Human Condition, and she has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Politico, and other publications. Most importantly, for our purposes, she is the author of a new book titled The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. Lexi Hudson, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
It is our pleasure. Thanks for being on. As I was saying to you before we started recording, starting to see your name everywhere. Your book is getting a lot of attention. And as you just told me, the Wall Street Journal just favorably reviewed it today. So you join us presumably in a very good mood.
I'm in a great mood. I'm always in a great mood. Yeah.
This is truly going to be a very, not only a civil discussion, but a happy discussion, I'm sure. So thanks for joining us. We'll ask you a number of questions about your book, and then we'll get to some of the things you're doing, like Civic Renaissance. Let's just start out with the basic question that you addressed at the very beginning of the book. What do you mean by civility, and what do you not mean?
So part of my story is that I was raised in a home very attentive to social norms and expectations. My mother is called Judy, the manners lady. She is, as I learned while writing my book, one of 4 women who are internationally renowned experts on manners, named Judy. There are 4 of them. Maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. I don't actually have an answer for it. But the most famous is Judith Martin, the Washington Post columnist. But there are 3 others, one of which is my mom. And so she trained us in the ways and means of politeness, but also just kind of other-oriented courtesy and kindness to the stranger and hospitality. But I always questioned these norms growing up. I always, I'm constitutionally allergic to authority. I hate being told what to do. I hate rules, arbitrary rules. I always want answers to why we do things the way we do them. To this day, someone tells me to do something, my first question is, what's the rationale? Is this like really a good use of my time and energy? But for the most part, despite me questioning them, I followed the rules of politeness and etiquette and propriety because my mother told me they would serve me well in work and school and life. And she was right until I got to federal government. I was at the United States Department of Education, 2017 to 2018. And while I was working there, everything I thought I knew to be true about myself, about the world around me, about getting along with others across difference was refuted and questioned. I saw these 2 extremes. On one hand, there were people with sharp elbows who were willing to do and say anything, step on anyone to get ahead. On the other hand, there were people who I thought were my people at first. They were people who would smile at me, flatter me one moment. They were suave, they were polished. They would stab me in the back the next, the moment I no longer served their purposes. And that really threw me. One thing my mother said to me growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward extension of our inward character. And yet here I was surrounded by people who were well-mannered enough, but ruthless and cruel. So that clarified for me this essential distinction between civility and politeness. I realized that those two extremes that I experienced in government, the extreme hostility, the extreme politesse, they're actually very similar. And those two extremes, first of all, they define our public life right now. It is defined today by people who are just, willing to step on anyone, destroy anyone who gets in their way, like the aggressive hostility. And then the extreme, tone policing and focus on rules and everyone, following the rules of propriety, whatever those are. But they're very similar because both modes fail to sufficiently appreciate the dignity of the human person. They fail to sufficiently appreciate the personhood, the worth of the other. Both instead, they see others as means to their end. They see others as means to be destroyed along the way or means to be manipulated along the way. And I realize what we need instead is a disposition that actually respects others. We need civility. So that's part of my argument that politeness is etiquette, it's manners, it's external, it's this, superficial stuff. It's behavior, it's technique, whereas civility is a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals that treats them with the dignity that they deserve. And that sometimes means being impolite. It means telling hard truths. It means engaging in robust debate. So what I do mean, and I do think we need more of in society, is civility, this actually respecting of others. And we need less, what I don't mean is politeness, which is this faux kind of niceness that is manipulative at its worst. And at its best, it's insufficient. It's not going to be enough to heal our deep divides and to help us overcome the deep differences that we have to navigate today.
And that's what really stands out to me. And I think that's probably the way in which your book is going to be most misunderstood, I'm going to guess, by people who don't read it, is that you don't just mean politeness. It's a civility. Not only is it a disposition, but it's rooted in a particular moral proposition or moral understanding of the human person that is itself contested now. And it seems to me the reason we see these two extremes is because there's no longer a strong commitment to that proposition that all people are created equal and have, equal dignity and virtue of their personhood. Would you agree?
Yes, we live in this era where the stakes feel incredibly high. We hear on both sides of the political spectrum this sort of apocalyptic rhetoric that we have to be willing to do and say anything necessary to win. The other side is just too bad, too evil, too wrong, and the stakes are too high for us to inherently respect the dignity and personhood of the other. And I mean, Dr. King knew this. Many of the abolitionists knew this in the fight against slavery in this country, that the problem with that sort of utilitarian thinking, like we're going to step on some people and, undermine the dignity and personhood of some people in the sake of pursuing equality of others, like that you can't if you claim that all people are created equal and are beings with dignity and worth, you can't undermine the dignity and personhood of some along the way to achieving your end. This was Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and the abolitionists. This is Dr. King and his civil rights, peaceful, nonviolent resistance movement during the civil rights era. That means matter. And you can't cut corners. You can't instrumentalize others. You can't say, we're going to disrespect this contingent of people for the sake of equality of this people. Like how you treat everyone matters. And in fact, when we are cruel and malicious to any human being, it doesn't just hurt us. It doesn't just hurt others, rather, it hurts ourselves too. That is a key insight that Dr. King makes about slavery and segregation. He says it hurts both parties. It doesn't just hurt the segregated, but it obviously does. It also hurts the segregator. It deforms their soul. And that's the case that I make about civility, that it's good for it's good for society. It's good for its own sake, but it's mutually ennobling. That's where the title, the soul of civility, comes from. In treating another human being with the dignity that they and respect that they deserve, we ennoble them, we affirm them, we see them as they really are in their fullness and richness and complexity, and that ennobles us too. My book is in many ways, in that way, and in others, a humanistic manifesto, helping us reclaim a high view of humanity and the dignity of the human person.
Even our political opponents apparently are due that kind of respect. So means matter is essentially the quickest way to define the difference between the approach of a Martin Luther King Jr. and, say, Antifa.
Of course. Yeah.
Burning down cities, for instance, and peaceful non-resistance. So, it seems means matter seems really the dividing line between sort of the revolutionary who is too impatient with his political opponents, his or her political opponents, to treat them with respect, and someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or other reformers we might. William Lord Garrison, I'm a little bit, by the way, I'd be ambivalent about that one. I don't know how much Garrison respected his political opponents. That's a historical question, but someone like King, that comes out, because it does seem. Here's another question for you that I'm sure you're going to get if you haven't already. You're already starting to deal with it in your answers, but don't people who cry for more civility often just mean shut up and do what your rulers tell you to do? Like, isn't it something that the powerful use to attempt to delegitimize the complaints and protests of the powerless? Yeah,
there are two main contingents today. On one hand, there are people that say, we just need more civility and politeness in our public life. And, that'll help us get through this era of deep division and social and cultural political brokenness. On the other hand, there are people who say, no, civility and politeness, they're part of the problem. They're tools of the patriarchy. They're tools of the people of white supremacists, of people in positions of power to keep the powerless powerless. And what both these contingents miss is again, this essential distinction between civility and politeness, that politeness, these social norms and propriety, they have been this tool of keeping the people in positions of power, powerlessness, powerless. Civility, by contrast, has and can once again be this tool of speaking truth to power, of informing social action. In my book, I reclaim the whole tradition of civil disobedience in my conception of what civility is, of civil protest, that sometimes taking action, standing up to authorities, speaking truth to power, that is a duty of citizenship. When our regime, when our government contravenes a moral law, and this is, the same framework Dr. King uses to distinguish between a just and unjust moral law, I use to distinguish between just and unjust norms, social norms as well, that we should have that same litmus test. Like, what are the norms and the laws that affirm human dignity and personhood and uplift human personality? And we should celebrate those. And what are those that degrade it, that codify abhorrent value systems that elevate some types of human beings over others? We should stand up against those. We should abolish those. We should, make those matter less. We should protest. And this is exactly what Dr. King teaches us. But that in his nonviolent, passive, nonviolent, peaceful resistance, he had this system of purification where everyone who wanted to protest with him and join him in his movement had to first cultivate love and respect for the white supremacists, for the bigots that they were protesting. And that is what informed their action. So civility, I like to say, both demands action sometimes, but it also takes action off the table too. It takes certain actions off the table. So in the civil rights movement's instance, that love, that affection, that respect, that esteem for fellow citizens, fellow human beings is what informed the protests, the sit-ins, the marches. It said, I'm not going to coddle you in your misperception of the world. You are inaccurately seeing the world. And I'm going to show you that the hypocrisy and the injustice of of your inaccurate views of the world. And so it compelled that action. But civility also takes certain actions off the table. And it says, I respect the person and dignity enough not to destroy someone's property and livelihood, not to engage in ad hominem attacks, not to hurt another human being, and therefore corrode their dignity as a person. So civility, contrary to what many think, is in fact this powerful tool of social change. It's both an inherent good, because it's right in and of itself to treat another human being with the dignity that they deserve, but it is also an instrumental good in that it has and can once again be this tool of achieving equality and social justice in our world.
You're getting at this next question already, I think, but maybe you'll have some specific advice or wisdom on this next question, which is, and this is one I kept coming back to as I was reading your book. How can we be civil in the meaning of the term that you use to people who seek to cancel or deplatform us? In other words, how can we be civil to people who don't believe in the ground rules of civility themselves? There's a certain sort of asymmetry that comes into play when, just take an extreme example, Lenin is your opponent, right? I mean, to take a less extreme example, that your opponent is like not committed to civility themselves, just wants to shut you up, and will do anything more or less to make that happen. What should be the civil person's sort of posture in such a situation?
We live in this world where we're so conditioned to see other people by one aspect of who they are. And so it with like this strange essentialism where, all we need to know is who someone voted for, what their view is on one issue, where they live. And that's enough to call them, a bigot or, a horrible human being or someone who's not worth our time, a bad person. So when you encounter people like that, I think that the best approach is to show them that they're wrong, like engage them at a human level, at the level of friendship, even, try that. And, refuting their preconceived notions of you with just a gracious word or, offering to buy them a drink. And the example I love to use of this is my friend, Daryl Davis. Do you know Daryl? Have you had him on the show?
No, I don't. Maybe I should tell me about Daryl.
Yeah. So he is an African-American jazz musician, and that's his vocation. His passion, he would say, is changing the world's mind about, racist ideas. So for 40 years, he has been befriending, taking out to dinner, taking out to drinks, members of the Ku Klux Klan.
I have heard of Daryl. Okay.
And converting them away from their like morally abhorrent and disgusting views of the world. And he was raised in a home. His parents were in the diplomatic corps, and he was raised in the kind of a colorblind world where he went to international schools and saw people of different skin color, languages, different, eating different foods. And those differences didn't matter. Like being surrounded by those differences, he would say, helped him see what we all have in common as human beings. And that's like the most salient thing to him, is that we're all human beings. And he was 10 years old when he moved back to the United States with his parents. And this is like in the 1970s in America. And he was bullied on his way home from school. Some white kids threw rocks at him and harassed him, and he had no idea why. He got home and his parents sat him down and described to him what racism was for the first time. And he was so perplexed. He's like, how could these people hate me if they don't even know me? He was just absolutely flabbergasted. And that experience stayed with him. And then several years, later, when he was a little older, he was once at a bar, and he ended up striking up a conversation with a Caucasian gentleman who he had a beer with, and who revealed himself to be a member of the KKK. And when pressed, the gentleman said that he had never sat down and had a beer with a Black person before. Like never shared, a space, ever had a real conversation with them. And Daryl was like, how is that even possible? People have, I've had drinks with millions of white guys. Like, how is this even possible? But he realized that so much of these preconceived notions about others come from a lack of experience, firsthand experience with the personhood, the fullness and richness of others. And so that is when he started making it his life's mission to seek out and befriend these people of hate groups who despise him. They despise African Americans, but he'll offer them friendship. They'll cultivate relationships around a love of music, a love of children, a love of a million other things, and that shows them that they're wrong about him. And if Daryl can do it, if Daryl can like seek these conversations out, people that are from a hate group that despise him and people that look like him, like we can do that too.
That's a great example and actually something actionable for everyone. It clearly part of the challenge that we're experiencing today is such as preconceived notions, but the notions one gets from sort of the false knowing that we get via social media, comment boxes, other forms of media we have today. We think we know somebody, right? And people do, and people say things on social media in ways they never would say to your face. They're completely without, nuance, caveats. It just calls forth extremism. I think in your book, you actually advise people to limit their social media intake pretty dramatically. Yeah,
I do.
For that reason.
For many reasons. Digital mediated communication is definitely new. Part of my argument is that this question of my book is the most important question of our day. How might we flourish across deep difference? But it's also a timeless question. It is not a new question. Human nature doesn't change. We're just as predisposed to there's a duality in our nature. We're profoundly social as a species. We thrive in relationship and in community with others, but we're also profoundly selfish. We're defined by self-love, morally and biologically. We're geared to meet our own needs before others. And those two facets of who we are in tension. And that is why in all times and places, society, community, friendship, civilization itself has been fragile. It is never a foregone conclusion. So much is the same about this issue where we are struggling with the same duality in our nature between the social and the selfish today that we were at the dawn of our species. And yet there are many things about our current moment that are new. For example, social media, the ubiquity of the news cycle. There are just so many things that are incredibly vexing and pose particular challenges to our current moment. And as you noted, social media is one of these things that makes it all the more important to kind of do what we can to reclaim the humanity and dignity and keep ourselves mindful of the person on the other side of that interaction. One thing I try to do and also advise in the book, one is limit social media, limit virtual engagement and wherever you can be in person. But also when you have to be online, I call it cultivating your digital garden. Like it can feel like a cesspool just getting on Twitter and just seeing everyone yelling at everyone else. And I mean, yeah, it's true. One person's mistruth, hurtful word can now reach millions in an instant. Churchill noted this 70 years ago. He said that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put his pants on. And that's exactly true. That's all the more true, even in this day and age, the era of social media. And but what can we do to be a part of the solution? We can wield how we use these tools, these really powerful tools, very well. And we can cultivate our digital garden, creating beauty, and create a little oasis. That's what I've done with Civic Renaissance, my newsletter and intellectual community of nearly 50,000 people who are dedicated to beauty, goodness, and truth, who care about ideas that reviving the wisdom of the past to help us lead better lives. And, I realize I can't control the Twitter trolls. I can't control, how other people are using social media and these digital platforms, but I can decide how I'll use them. And I'm choosing to use them to be part of the solution, sowing seeds of trust and goodwill, wisdom, beauty, and grace and charity in our world today. Well,
very good. We will need to take a break. Alexi, we'll be right back and talk to Alexandra Hudson, author of The Soul of Civility, more about civility in education, civil society, and Larry David, among other things. We'll be right back.
Hey folks, I'm Jack Fowler, the author of Civil Thoughts. That's the free weekly email newsletter for the Center for Civil Society at AMPHIL, where we try to strengthen civil society. Civil Thoughts gives you a dozen plus recommended readings. Here's a link. Here's an excerpt of important articles and essays that I've come across in the previous week. I think anyone who's intelligent, dear intelligent American, that you will like it. So how do you get Civil Thoughts? Well, you go to civilthoughts.com, sign up. Trust me, it's totally free, risk-free. We're not selling your name to anybody. You'll enjoy it. civilthoughts.com.
All right, we are back with Alexandra Hudson, author of a new book titled The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. It is not just a book of abstract theorizing, very much a book of a practical book and a book of advice and wisdom, as you've already been hearing. Lexi, here's a question for you. I'll move on to the next topic that you cover a lot in the book. If civility rests on a particular moral foundation, which you've been talking about, it would seem that to inculcate true civility requires a very particular kind of education. What does that kind of education look like? And assuming we've lost it, which I'm just going to go ahead and make that assumption, how could we potentially recover it?
Well, originally, the education has been this process of creating good humans, cultivating the best in our humanity, the best in our nature, in ourselves, and unlocking our potential. The Latin root of the word education is educare, which means to bring forth and lead out. And that's what education ought to do. It should bring out that which is best in us and free us from our baser natures and the worst parts of ourselves. In the book, I connect the ancient Greek conception of this idea of education, paideia, to the Latin version of this education, humanitas, to modern day civility. So paideia was, it was in ancient Greece, it was culture, but also education, and it was soulcraft. It was ordering the passions of our souls. That the idea was that our souls as human beings are inherently disordered. We are geared to love ourselves and love others not as we should. St. Augustine, so this is we get this from Plato. Plato's idea of a just soul was a rightly ordered soul, wisdom, ruling our passions through our courage, through our self-control. And Plato said that a society of just souls who have rightly ordered loves and passions, that comprises a just society as well. St. Augustine of Hippo was a theist. He was a Christian. He conceived of this idea of rightly ordered loves, and rightly ordered loves was where a person loved God first, other self last. And that's the dual commandment that Christ gives his followers: love God, love others. And so, secular and religious thinkers have conceived of this notion like we're sick, and our sickness is a disorder of our loves, and education is the process of correcting those disordered loves and rightly order them, teaching us who we ought to be and how we ought to be in society, and cultivating our humanity, ordering our loves, helping it bring forth as we cultivate our own humanity and come to appreciate the high gift of being human. We appreciate that in others too. So that was paideia in ancient Greek, in ancient Greece. This concept found expression in the Roman world as humanitas, and that's where we get our word humanities from. This is what education was. It was to humanize us, to make us not just more human, but also more humane, more gentle, and less savage.
The idea is we need to be educated into becoming as human as we are made to be. Ultimately, right? I mean, we're not natural humans. So all of this is in direct contrast. All in direct contrast to Rousseau, right? We get in the late 1700s and the sort of the ideas behind the French Revolution. But isn't it Rousseau and his heirs who are captains of sort of our school system, generally speaking, today? And isn't that the problem?
So I really love Rousseau. Rousseau's treatise on education is a little book called Emile, and it's incredibly influential in educational circles, especially in France. But it's all about, I've been really influenced by it and how I've raised my kids. It's like experiential learning, like learning through prancing around in nature and experiencing nature and experiencing our senses, inhabiting our bodies. So, I have a lot of compassion for Rousseau, and there's a lot to praise about Rousseau. But where he was wrong, like Rousseau was not a very good parent. He wasn't a parent.
He was a famously bad parent, I would say.
Exactly, a pretty famous bad parent. Abandoned his kids, and so like he never like raised kids. And like if he had, he would have seen like, no, we're not. Our kids are not little angels. Like I have to teach my kids every minute of every day to surrender their ego, surrender their selfishness, and serve. Serve me, serve. I tell my son to serve his sister, like that it's not natural to us. It's natural for us to meet our own needs first. And we don't do that automatically. And we have to be reminded of it constantly. And that's what education is. In my education chapter, I conceive it as this partnership between teachers and schools, and also parents, that you can't just expect one person, like you can't just throw a kid in a classroom and expect them to come out, perfectly civilized if they're, not supported and cultivated and refined and humanized at home, that it is this joint project at its best, and that we need to recover that sort of partnership, and also this vision of education as the liberating arts, liberating us. This is the liberal arts, right? Like freeing us from these uglier parts of ourselves, so that we become truly human and truly free.
And the specific example you give of that is classical education. You believe you talk about Great Hearts in particular as an example. It's a classical school network based here in Arizona and in Texas and several other states, I think, at this point as well. How is classical education in particular well suited to sort of developing the moral habits of civility in children?
So classical education, this is back to paideia and humanitas. This is the vision of education of, cultivating the fullness of our humanity through exposing us to many different genres and disciplines. So from geometry to astronomy to literature and rhetoric and philosophy and poetry, like cultivating, our heart, mind, and soul, all aspects of who we are, to bring about the fullness of our humanity, but also so that we might contribute to public life. And this is where there's a forgotten link between the classical education and civics education. Historically, they've been part of the same project, creating good humans and creating good citizens to be in public life. And so this has, historically been the case. And today these worlds are kind of segmented. There's the classical renewal that's going on right now in America. And then there's the civics education that, wants to create good patriots and good Americans. But they are united in the same project, the educational project. And paideia was linked to this concept of philanthropia, which is cultivating a love of humanity. That is what that is.
In fact, so philanthropia, that's a good segue into civil society. You talk about civility as the lifeline or building block of civil society. Philanthropists, givers, are those who support civil society in a number of ways. Here's my question. You can elaborate on how civility is a lifeline or building block of civil society if you want. I would love for you to do that. But also, I would like your ideas on what givers could do or should not do to promote civility. I don't know if you've thought about that question at all. Like, you're a giver.
Well, one thing I like to say is that we all can be philanthropists. Like if we look at the historical conception of that word, loving our fellow man, we can all do that in ways great and small. We don't have to be, large gift givers in order to love our fellow man. We can do that right here, right now, in our everyday in ways great and small. And we all should. That is what we're called to do. That is what we have to do in society to see our society is sustained. But in terms of, is your question about how donors particularly can create cultures? I mean, in the checks they write, the gifts that they give, they can require there be that cultures of civility. They can encourage cultures of civility, cultures of humanity and humaneness and gentleness. They can choose to support classical education and choose to support, the civics education, like institutions that are actually doing this on the ground. Because there are, I highlight one in the public school system, but there are many others. Many of them are parochial and religious in nature, but this is happening in the public school system as well. But most of all, I think that a really powerful teacher is example. Like living by example. It's one thing to, write big checks. What does it look like to live in alignment with these values ourselves? Like, are we being gentle and kind and humane to people and how we live our lives every single day? I think it can be one thing I try to move past in my book is this spirit of rigid legalism, where people feel like I'm following the rules of politeness, therefore I'm a good person. I'm doing enough, but my whole point is that human life is way too complex and nuanced for rules, a list of static rules to just be enough. And that we need the disposition of civility to inform when we should break the rules in the name of actually loving and actually respecting someone. And so I think as that relates to givers, it can be tempting to be like, okay, I've written this check. I feel good about myself, like I've done my duty. I've like done my civic, but it's like, no, like that's really, if you can give, but also live it. Like literally embody these ideals of gentleness and humanity. Like that's what being a philanthropist really is.
The much noted decrease in volunteering and participation in institutions of civil society explains causally at least part of the decrease in civility we seem to have witnessed in the last couple of generations. Would you buy that argument?
Can you restate the question?
Yeah. So we know from Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, and many others that if anybody who's been listening to this podcast knows, we go over it all the time with different guests, a significant decrease in volunteering, significant decrease in simply participation in the institutes of civil society, whether that's joining clubs, fraternal organizations, even in some cases like voting, other aspects of civic behavior. I think it's this sort of privatization of our lives, the de-civilization of our lives, you might say. Is that partly why we've seen a decrease in civility? Because we're not encountering others out in civic space in the same way?
So, I mean, it's really interesting. I have a chapter on civil society in my book. And one thing I try to do in that chapter is like zoom way out. Like we often hear Robert Putnam tossed about as like the beginning and end of all things civil society in America. But if we zoom out and like look at the human historical record, like we see like this is a question that is a tale as old as time. This question of how do we overcome our selfishness and join to do things together and thrive as a society. I talk about Aristotle, who wrote about civil society, Civilitas Societae, which was conceiving of like our bonds between strangers and friends alike. And I talk about Ibn Khaldun, who was a North African scholar of civil society who was worried about commercialism corroding our social bonds. He called it abyssaya, this kind of fellow feeling, this bond between citizens. Adam Ferguson, who wrote the essay on the origins of civil society, was also worried about these things, worried about commerce threatening our social bonds. A guy named Robert Nisbet famously wrote this book called The Quest for Community. He was worried about war. He was worried about war being this thing that was crowding out civil society and corroding these social and civic bonds. And then a guy named Putnam comes along, right? And I forgot even Tocqueville in there, right? Tocqueville was someone who was like praising civil society and worried about things like populism, tyranny of the majority, how they might affect civil society. What's really interesting, I think, two things about that. This is a timeless question. There are no golden eras. Like this is like a human problem. It's a human question, and that people have been grappling with this for a very long time. I think that's helpful to zoom out into the whole picture of this question of civil society, of human community. And secondly, when people make claims of decline and quote unquote golden eras, like the golden era of the 1950s, 1960s that Putnam talks about in his book, that was Nisbet's. That was his perilous era in the quest for community. That's literally when he wrote his very famous book saying, oh my gosh, civility and community is in peril. So it's like, I think it's really interesting to look at these different narratives and put them in dialogue with one another. But the point about your question is that despite the intractability of this problem, the timelessness of this problem, there are things to be worried about, as things like friendship and community and church attendance. These have been on the decline in recent decades. And what's worrying about that is that these have been traditional touchstones of meaning in people's lives. And we find instead people turning to politics to find their ultimate meaning in public life. And I argue in my final chapter that too many of us have misplaced our meaning in politics, and we're overdoing democracy and therefore undermining democracy as a result. And that's deeply problematic because we're all in fight or flight constantly. Like our lizard brains are constantly activated. It's no longer, Jeremy and I having a disagreement about an intellectual issue or a policy issue. It's, oh my gosh, Jeremy disagrees with me. And now my very existence, my identity feels threatened. And it's not going to be a productive, healthy, rational conversation, which is what democracy requires. And so my final chapter on misplaced meaning and forgiveness, I talk about reclaiming things in our lives that are beyond politics, things like intellectual curiosity, like friendship across difference, like beauty, creating habits of rituals of beauty, encountering the sublime in our everyday to fill us up and give us the equanimity we need to do the hard thing of life together. We need to consciously cultivate habits and rituals of non-political activities in order to do politics and democracy better.
That's well put. And I want to come back to something you mentioned about speaking of unproductive conversations. Let's fulfill my promise that we're going to talk about Larry David here before we close our interview. Larry David famously having many unproductive conversations, I believe. Curb Your Enthusiasm. Anybody who's watched the show knows. And you point out he's sort of he's very interesting. Actually, I think about this a lot, and it's completely trivial. But I think about it like, what is the message of Curb Your Enthusiasm when it comes to civility? In one sense, Larry David is a great defender of at least the rules. Maybe he's not actually though committed to civility. Is that how you would think about Larry David? Because he's always getting in trouble for policing the rule, right? And then of course, oftentimes then he himself gets in trouble for breaking some trivial rule that's usually not as bad as the rule that he's caught somebody breaking himself. How do you understand Larry David?
That's kind of the conceit of the show, that he's always calling other people out, and then he's always caught doing the exact same thing at the end that gets him into trouble. But it's very funny. I argue that Larry David is the foremost defender of civilization in our world today. He
so it's not a strong statement you have. He's just the foremost defender of civilization.
That's right. That's exactly right. Like, we need people like Larry David. He calls himself a social assassin because he keeps other people in check. Like, he sees his social infractions and he's like, you know what? This is society, sir. You cannot double park. You cannot cut in line. Like, he'll be like, you know what? Get to the back. Like, and you need people like that. If we don't want a police state too, and I tell stories in my book of instances where modern and historic governments have tried to legislate politeness and courtesy and just common decency towards our fellow citizens, which we don't want. It's never going to be effective, and it's a waste of time, and it's making criminals where criminals aren't. You can't legislate voluntary acts of courtesy and kindness, but Larry David is certainly an effective reminder to you to think about others before yourself, or at least think of others alongside yourself.
He may be hated for it if his experiences on Curb or any
or beloved for it. Like, I certainly respect. He's everyone's inner ego and inner it. Like, what people love about him is that he does what we all wish we could do. Like, he calls people out for the things that we wish we could call them out for.
Yes, he doesn't have a conscience when it comes to policing civility in suburban Los Angeles. Well, Alexandra Hudson, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Alexandra is the author of The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves, which you can buy anywhere books are sold. Obviously, Amazon as usual, but also Katie, my producer, now puts on a list of places that are not Amazon on the show notes here. So Shop Local, Target, Wild Geese, Powell's, Books A Million, and bookshop.org. You can find Lexi's book. You can follow her on I guess we call it X now, the artist formerly known as Twitter, at Lexi O Hudson, correct?
That's right.
And AlexandraOHudson.com is her website. She is sort of on tour right now, promoting this book, speaking in a lot of different places. So you can find out if she's going to be anywhere near you by going to AlexandraOHudson.com. And what's the website for Civic Renaissance, Lexi?
It's just civic-renaissance.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us, Lexi, and good luck with your Quixotic project to create a more civil society. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe and/or rate and review this discussion on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. And have a guest you'd like to hear from? Send your request to our producer, Katie Janis, at kjanis@amphil.com. That's KJANUS@amphil.com.